Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. It's so funny you should say this, because if you were one of my students, you'd be wearing your pain like a badge of honor. This generation doesn't hide anything from anyone. My class talks a lot about their traumas, and how their traumas inform their games. They honest to God think their traumas are the most interesting thing about them. I sound like I'm making fun, and I am a little, but I don't mean to be. They're so different from us, really. Their standards are higher. They call bullshit on some of the sexism and racism that I, at least, just lived with. But that's also made them kind of, humorless. I hate people who talk about generational differences like it's an actual thing, and here I am, doing it. If their traumas are the most interesting things about them, how do they get over any of it? Sam asked. I don't think they do. Or maybe they don't have to. I don't know. Sadie paused. Since I've been teaching, I keep thinking about how lucky we were, she said. We were lucky to be born when we were. How so? Well, if we'd been born a little bit earlier, we wouldn't have been able to make our game so easily. Access to computers would have been harder. We would have been part of the generation who was putting floppy disks in Ziploc bags and driving the games to stores. And if we'd been born a little later, there would have been even greater access to the internet and certain tools. But honestly, the games got so much more complicated. The industry got so professional. We couldn't have done as much as we did on our own. We could have never made a game that we could sell to a company like Opus on the resources we had. We wouldn't have made Ichigo Japanese because we would have been worried about the fact that we weren't Japanese. And I think because of the internet, we would have been overwhelmed by how many people were trying to do the exact same things we were. We had so much freedom, creatively, technically. No one was watching us, and we weren't even watching ourselves. What we had was our impossibly high standards, and your completely theoretical conviction that we can make a great game. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is a third-person omniscient literary fiction novel. I think this book was moderately worth my time. That said, I'm happy I read it, and I was very satisfied with how the book ended. Despite not being all that engaged in the text, I somehow wasn't ever bored, so I suppose it is interesting enough. In turn, on a scale from 0 to 5, I would recommend this book out of 3. So, what's this book about? It's hard to say, honestly. Not even the synopsis could help. It mentions identity, disability, failure, the need to connect, and love, on top of fame, joy, tragedy, duplicity, and immortality. Of course, those motifs are recurring throughout this novel, but in no way do I think the book is about any of those things in particular. But if I think about it and do the math, add everything together, I conclude that this book is about life. The things that happened in Sam and Sadie's. Our main characters are Sam and Sadie, lifelong friends. The plot revolves around them, but I feel like Sam's other best friend, Marks, is who this novel is about. I justify this by the influence Marks has on both Sam and Sadie. Many things wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Marks, and because this novel is third-person omniscient, we see the true influence that he has. He treats Sam as a brother and helps him stay on his feet. He respects and believes in Sam well enough that he allowed him and Sadie to stay in his apartment so they can work on their first game together. Later, Marks basically parent traps them, and that is the start of their very successful business. Not to mention, the book is pretty much titled after him. Now, we know our characters, but did I care for them? And did I care about how the novel would end? This is a weird answer to say the least. I didn't particularly care all that much for Sam, Sadie, nor Marks, and yet I was still able to make it through the book, relatively intrigued. Maybe it was because I knew from the beginning that it wasn't going to be one of those books where you had to worry about the characters. Maybe I knew that it was going to be one of those life books. And really, how much do the majority of people change over their life? Do real people have arcs like heroes do? So maybe I was just there to be with them, to observe them, and I'm okay with that. Though, if I managed to misplace this book and never find it, I wouldn't be that upset. To expand and clarify, no. There isn't really much character development in this novel, but it works here. Sam remains determined and sometimes too overconfident with his words, and Sadie remains sort of angry and depressed. Not even their friendship grows past a certain point. But there's enough going on in their world that it makes up for the staticness of their minds and personalities. Now let's talk about what happens. A lot happens in Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. This book is about life. But this book is about life. So all the same, nothing happens at all. In a nutshell, Sam runs into Sadie, a friend he hasn't seen in ages. They're both in college. Sadie gives the game she made to Sam. Sam loves the game. Sam decides he wants to make a game with Sadie. Sadie agrees. They make the game. The game is successful. They make more. In between all of this, we dig into a little bit of our characters' backgrounds and their other relationships. All of that and more. These things are emotional things, but don't expect them to bring forth tears of sadness or of rage, with maybe the exception of the ending. Maybe, just maybe. See, this novel has a happy, full circle, intelligent ending that had me full on grinning. It gave me that bittersweet feeling of saying goodbye to someone who you might not see for a very long time. So yes, the book gets 3 stars, but that ending gets 5 out of 5 hearts. We have those books that once you read them, you can't wait until you have the chance to sell your soul, or at least forget about the plot so you can have a great reread experience. Is this novel one of those books? Well, I'll say that it's definitely the type of book that you can reread. Its non-linear nature and its specific dates lend to a read that will have you daring to create a timeline and connect some dots. I also think there might be a hidden message of sorts that you may be able to decode upon a reread or two. But if I were to, I'd love having the satisfaction of getting to read the bittersweet full circle ending, and I would dislike having to reread the few times the fourth wall was broken. It really took me out of the story, and I dislike that very much. Okay, let's do some comparisons now and talk about other authors and books that I see in this novel. Firstly, I must mention that I see Murakami because of some of Zevin's incredible dialogue. It was crafted so natural and flowed so well. Here's an example. It's from when Sam and Sadie first met. I believe it was when they were about 11. What's the secret to landing high on the flagpole? Hold down the run button as long as you can. Then crouch down and jump just before you're about to fall, the boy said. Sadie landed on top of the flagpole. Hey, it worked. I'm Sadie, by the way. Sam. Your turn. She turned the controller to him. What's wrong with you? She asked. I was in a car accident, Sam said. My foot is broken in 27 places. That's a lot of places, Sadie said. Are you exaggerating, or is that the number? It's the number. I'm very particular about numbers. Me too. But sometimes the number goes up slightly because they have to break other parts of it to reset it, Sam said. They might have to cut it off. I can't stand on it at all. I've already had 3 surgeries and it's not even a foot. It's a flesh bag with bone chips in it. Sounds delicious, Sadie said. Sorry if that was gross. Your description made me think of potato chips. We skip a lot of meals since my sister got sick, and I don't think anyone would notice if I starved to death. All I've had today is a pudding cup. You're weird, Sadie, Sam said, with interest in his voice. I know, Sadie said. I really hope they don't have to amputate your foot, Sam. My sister has cancer, by the way. Secondly, there's Norwegian Wood by Murakami. But this is more surface level. It's just that Marx's last name is Watanabe, and he dates a girl named Midori. And if you know, you know. Lastly, John Green. And this is because there are nerdy characters doing and saying nerdy type stuff. And let's also talk about some more fun stuff. All right, so my biggest take from this novel. My biggest take actually wasn't a real take at all, but it was the art. Musicians and literal artists alike. Yes, I know this book spotlights video games, lots of them, but it was the introduction of 2 pieces of art in one band that will forever be with me and will forever remind me of Sam, Sadie, and Marx. Firstly, The Great Wave by Katsuchika Hakusai. This is when Sadie is about to move into Marx's apartment that he shares with Sam. Sadie, Sam said gently. You can take the art, you know. Marx won't mind if you hang it. Sadie continued to stare at the Hakusai wave. Sadie, Sam repeated. Sam, look at this. She pushed him a little so that he had the same vantage point she did. This is what the game should look like. The Hakusai print on Sadie's wall was an exhibition poster from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it was identified as the Great Wave at Kanagawa. In Japanese, the title is far more ominous, something like Under the Wave off Kanagawa. Secondly, there's Cherry Blossoms at Night. This is at a dinner with Marx, his dad, and Sadie. Watanabe-san and Sadie exchanged gifts. She brought him a pair of carved wooden Ichigo chopsticks that their Japanese distributor had made to celebrate the release of the second Ichigo in Japan. In return, he gave her a silk scarf with a reproduction of Cherry Blossoms at Night by Katsushika Oi on it. The painting depicts a woman composing a poem on a slate in the foreground. The titular cherry blossoms are in the background, all but a few of them deep in shadow. Despite the title, the cherry blossoms are not the subject. It is a painting about the creative process, its solitude, and the ways in which an artist, particularly a female one, is expected to disappear. The woman's slate appears to be blank. I know Hakusai is an inspiration for you, Watanabe-san said. This is by Hakusai's daughter. Only a handful of her paintings survive, but I think she's even better than the father. Lastly is a band that will forever remind me of Sam and Sadie. This is them meeting for the first time in forever at that crowded train station. Sam was about to call her name, but then he didn't. He felt overwhelmed by how much time had passed since he and Sadie had last been alone together. How could a person still be as young as he objectively knew himself to be, and have had so much time pass? And why was it suddenly so easy to forget that he despised her? Time, Sam thought, was a mystery. But with a second's reflection, he thought better of such sentiment. Time was mathematically explicable. It was the heart, the part of the brain represented by the heart, that was the mystery. Sadie finished staring at whatever the crowd was staring at, and now she was walking toward the inbound Red Line train. Sam called her name. Sadie! In addition to the rumble of the incoming train, the station was roaring with the usual humanity. A teenage girl played Penguin Cafe Orchestra on a cello for tips. Being me, I, of course, immediately looked them up and hit play. Hearing this music for the first time was most definitely a shock to the ear, but one like me gets accustomed. And if you're feeling adventurous, my favorites are Perpetua Mobile and Telephone and Rubber Band, followed by The Snake and the Lotus, The Sound of Someone You Love Who's Going Away and It Doesn't Matter, and Paul's Dance. They'll be linked in the description below. So, are the reviews accurate? For me, some are and some aren't. Some say Sam and Sadie are annoying. In my most humble and probably wrong opinion, Sam and Sadie were not actively annoying at all. Sure, they might have been annoying, but not so much so that I even realized how much while reading, or afterwards really. They were just being humans, so. Another said, slightly confusing and undecided narrative voice, but fun and easy to read overall. I completely agree. There were two parts wherein I was like, where did I go? Where am I? But it explained itself and then everything was back to being normal. And John Green said, it's one of the best books I have read, one of the best books that I have ever read. This makes me wonder how many books he's read and what those books are. Before we get to triggers, I should make a quick note to say that this book is not only for gamers, despite its frequent reference to video games. The triggers that this book contains are along the lines of something that's not quite sexual abuse, which Zevin makes very clear, but Sadie finds herself in a relationship that's not quite safe for her. There is a woman who jumps off a building in an attempt of suicide. People die of cancer. There's an amputation. and the effects of that. There's very little drug use. There's terrorism, which is 9/11, and domestic terrorism / hate crime, and homophobia. Lastly, let's discuss some interesting takes and topics that Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin presents. Firstly, cultural appropriation. Sam and Sadie make a game called Ichigo. Ichigo is full of Japanese references, but neither Sam nor Sadie are Japanese. It was 1996, and the word appropriation never occurred to either of them. They were drawn to these references because they loved them, and they found them inspiring. They weren't trying to steal from another culture, though that is probably what they did. Consider Sam in a 2017 interview with Kotaku celebrating the 20th anniversary Nintendo Switch port of the original Ichigo. Kotaku. It is said that the original Ichigo is one of the most graphically beautiful low-budget games ever made, but its critics also accused it of appropriation. How do you respond to that? Sam. I do not respond to that. Kotaku. Okay, but would you make the same game if you were making it now? No, because I am a different person than I was then. Kotaku. In terms of its obvious Japanese references, Ichigo looks like a character Yoshitomo Nara could have painted. The world design looks like Hakusai, except for the undead level, which looks like Murakami. The soundtrack sounds like Torishiro Mayuzumi. Sam. I won't apologize for the game Sadie and I made. We had many references. Dickens, Shakespeare, Homer, the Bible, Philip Glass, Chuck Close, Escher. And what is the alternative to appropriation? Kotaku. I don't know. Sam. The alternative to appropriation is a world in which artists only reference their own cultures. Kotaku. That's an oversimplification of the issue. Sam. The alternative to appropriation is a world where white European people make art about white European people, with only white European references in it. Swap African or Asian or Latin or whatever culture you want for European. A world where everyone is blind and deaf to any culture or experience that is not their own. I hate that world, don't you? I'm terrified of that world, and I don't want to live in that world. And as a mixed race person, I literally don't exist in it. My dad, who I barely knew, was Jewish. My mom was an American-born Korean. I was raised by Korean immigrant grandparents in Koreatown, Los Angeles. And as any mixed race person will tell you, to be half of two things is to be whole of nothing. And by the way, I don't own or have a particularly rich understanding of references of Jewishness or Koreanness because I happen to be those things. But if Ichigo had been fucking Korean, it wouldn't be a problem for you, I guess. What do you think? Do you agree with Sam? My answer will be in the comments. Secondly, how do you deal with a friend's depression? In my mind, Sadie means a lot to Sam, but maybe not. Listen to this. Sam was inviting Sadie to a work party. Sam had invited Sadie, though he knew she would not come. She was, according to Alice, overwhelmed. She has a pretty good case of postpartum depression going, I'd say, and that's on top of the depression she already had, Alice said. He still had the impulse to go to her house every day, like he had done when they'd been in college. But Sadie was an adult with a child, and Sam was an adult with a business to run, mostly by himself. So, do you think Sam should have gone by to check on her every day? Would you, if you were Sam? Keep in mind that they're about 30, but they've known each other for 2 decades. Also, Sadie's house wasn't out of the way. My answer, too, will be in the comments. Thank you so much for watching my review of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by adding to the discussion and leaving a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and share if you found this video helpful or pleasant in any way. I've been Kayla, this is Kayla's Reads and WIPs, and I will check you next time. Bye. I'm an obsessive player, so I've played through all 3 options. The Easter egg is behind door number 3. She clicked the third option and turned her laptop toward Sam. On stage, in the middle of white Elizabethan England, and probably stands a handsome Asian man as Macbeth. Macbeth has just heard the news that his wife had died, and he is giving the most famous soliloquy from the play, the Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow speech. When they had been deciding what to call their company all those years ago, Marx had argued for calling it Tomorrow Games, a name Sam and Sadie instantly rejected as too soft. Marx explained that the name referenced his favorite speech in Shakespeare, and that it wasn't soft at all. "Do you have any ideas that aren't from Shakespeare?" Sadie said. To make his case, Marx jumped up on a kitchen chair and recited the Tomorrow speech for them, which he knew by heart. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle! Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. "What does any of that have to do with games?" Sadie asked. "Isn't it obvious?" Marx said. It was not obvious to Sam or to Sadie. "What is a game?" Marx said. "It's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. It's a possibility of infinite rebirth, infinite redemption. The idea that if you keep playing, you could win. No loss is permanent because nothing is permanent. Ever."